I want to address some issues that are kind of in the background of a lot of the videos I've done on the current events involving both the conflict in the Middle East and also the Ukraine situation, and kind of see how my kind of go through what my kind of positions on that are. As far as the Middle East, I mean, I've always been basically supportive of Israel, and I think that while I've been following for some time the commentaries on the Judge Napolitano show and and his various guests, with the exception of Schaefer, I guess, but the rest of them are all extremely anti-Israel. And then of course you've got the Daniel Davis deep dive, which I follow somewhat too, and he's becoming more and more crazy in my opinion too. But I don't. But what I want to say is that on that, I think historically the way I look at it is that the Palestinians really fundamentally have nobody but themselves to blame. But because basically going back to the history of this whole thing, um, you had their actions have increasingly made the Israelis more and more militarized and militant. I mean, the early Israeli settlers in the area were buying land and moving there, and really weren't even particularly armed. And the Palestinian attacks against them basically led to the formation of what eventually became the Israeli Defense Forces. And the UN decision on the Palestine Mandate to create two separate entities there um, in 1948, uh, with Jerusalem being an independent, neutral capital, and by the way, the Palestinians getting the best land and the Israelis getting the rest. Um, you know, essentially would have been a deal that would have created the Palestinian state and everything. But it was rejected by both their leadership and all the neighboring Arab countries, which led to a series of wars, and which have ultimately got us to where we are today. And even this latest conflict that started on October 7th of 2023 was pretty much Hamas and the Iranians, I think, conspired to do this basically to disrupt the ongoing peace process between the various nations in the area. The possibility even of a Saudi Arabian recognition of Israel was on the table at the time that happened. And of course, I would also point out that um, the time that was chosen to launch this attack was when probably the most militant and right-wing Israeli government there's ever been was in power. I mean, if they'd have done this when maybe the other more moderate government was in power, the reaction might not have been as severe. At any rate, however, this was a particularly vicious terrorist attack, and of course it led to what might even be argued to some degree of overreaction. But I think that Israel finally decided to address the issue on the Gaza Strip, which had been left there ever since Ariel Sharon had pulled the Israelis out of it. And you know, I'm sure a lot of bad things have happened. This is a situation that then led to ongoing conflict with all the Iranian proxies, and ultimately led to all of them being suppressed, and then the final this 12-day war between Israel and Iran, which ended pretty much with the U.S. Strike with the B-2 bombers and cruise missiles. So, at any rate, I think maybe the ceasefire seems to be holding for now, and I guess at the present time, President Trump is working to negotiate some kind of a ceasefire in the Gaza thing. The problem there is, I don't know what that's going to consist of. I mean, uh, I think there's the ongoing battling has not been good for providing aid or to the Hamas is still holding out in the tunnels. So we'll have to see where that goes. But to me, I think that blaming Israel for all this is a little bit crazy. But however, um, and the ongoing conflict, I know that they're claiming that somehow Israel lost this conflict. Actually, these things usually there's no real winner there because until one side of to some degree until Israel, unless Israel's ultimately defeated and thrown in and the Jews thrown back into exile there, that the conflict will probably go on. I don't see any solution really. I mean, if you create a Palestinian state, my opinion is what it would do is arm up and then go to war against Israel, and you'd be back to where we are right now, only with more violence than we have at this time. And Israel being a nuclear weapon state and pretty well armed, even though a covert one or semi-covert one, their downfall would probably be far more destructive than any gain could be had, in the sense that, the, you know, as far as this Rising Lion operation that they launched, going into that, I was kind of the opinion that perhaps Israel should simply accept mutual deterrence. That is, they have an adequate nuclear capability that Iran would, you know, uh, really with an attack on Israel would lead to a massive destruction of Iran in retaliation. Of course, the downside for Israel is they would be destroyed. And probably the regime in Tehran would be destroyed along with the city and many other cities too. So, but that was not the option they chose, and Trump only decided somewhere in there decided to back it. So that's where we are. I'll see where that goes, but I think that's going to be an ongoing situation. My own opinion is Trump had a really good idea. If he could find a place to move the Palestinians that are now largely homeless and suffering in Gaza Strip to some other location where they could rebuild what they had in the Gaza Strip before this conflict, but far enough away from Israel that they couldn't launch another set of attacks of the type they've had. I think that just keeping them separate from each other is probably the best way to deal with it. By the way, if you like these videos, please give me a like, subscribe, and you can click the bell for notifications. Or I'll also post this on Rumble. Yeah, now on the issue of Ukraine, I have almost the opposite viewpoint. Whereas on the Israeli thing, I pretty much support the U.S. policy. On the case of Ukraine, I think that we've been wrong-headed from the outset. And the reason is, this goes back before the Russian action starting in 2022. Even in the teams, I mean, I was very critical of bringing even the Baltic states into NATO, because I thought at the time we're creating a situation that could easily be a tripwire to a war between Russia and NATO, and who knows what that would lead to. And I also thought there was probably no need to do it. But it was done, and this continual NATO expansion policy has led to ultimately the Russians actually going to war, which wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for this policy of trying to bring Ukraine and actually Georgia into NATO. Now it looks like the Georgian situation for the moment has been taken care of by Russia. I think they're that doesn't seem to be in the offing. The Ukrainian thing is in a war, which means if Ukraine goes into NATO, then we'll be at war with Russia in all probability, and that has the potential to going nuclear. Because I don't think that Russia is going to sit by and accept a conventional defeat as NATO armies march on Moscow and not use nuclear weapons. And when they do that, what do? And what happens then? And pretty quickly, we're all pretty well dead. And that's not a good situation to be. So, my own opinion is also, I think that Ukraine has been put up in many ways with this. And the other thing is the Ukrainian nationalist faction, which pulled a coup off in 2014, then triggered this whole set of events which led to our current calamity. And there was no need to do that. It represents hostility that goes back to many, many, many years. Certainly, I'm sure it goes back to things that happened during the years of the czars, and certainly that was in recent times the Stalinist purges and collectivization process that led to millions of deaths in Ukraine in that period there in the 20s and 30s, I guess 1930s, whatever it was, before World War II, has led to this incredible anxiety. And when the Germans invaded the Nazi regime, some Ukrainians decided to side with the Germans, and some Ukrainians decided to side with the Soviet government. And of course, I suppose the ones that were more Russian ethnics were the ones that went with the Soviet government, and probably the ones that were not were probably the ones that primarily decided to go with the Germans. And that's where the Russian propaganda line referring to them as Nazis comes from. It's not that the current Ukrainians have a group of people that are reading Mein Kampf and all that. Oh, they do. Some of the more militant groups do tend to use some symbolism that's similar to Nazis, but I think in reality they're basically Ukrainian nationalists and very hostile to Russian ethnics. Okay, and so that's kind of the situation really. And certain areas in the eastern Ukraine are primarily Russian ethnic, like Crimea and those areas in the Donbass and Luhansk areas, and perhaps even some of the areas down in Zaporizhia and so forth. Although there's obviously Ukrainian people, there's Ukrainians in Russia too, and there's Ukrainians kind of what you might call saboteurs that are inside of Russia. So that's why you keep hearing about these various sabotage events inside of Russia, and so that's an ongoing situation. Um, but the point is, everybody's trying to personalize this on Putin, like he's some kind of a. He's probably the most moderate, reasonable Russian leader we've had. Um, okay, compared to Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, and there's people that lasted in the interim. Maybe Gorbachev would be better, but he fell from power internally, not particularly due to anything else. He just internally fell from power. And Yeltsin was an interim figure who was fairly weak and I think very alcoholic and I think dysfunctional. At any rate, and after he was out of the picture, but I mean, Putin has actually been trying to modernize Russia. He's built a country before the war, at least, that had a good economy that took better care of its people than probably ever in history. But he's a Russian nationalist. He has pride in his country, and he doesn't want to be a mop for the rest of the world. Okay, and I don't think it's reasonable to expect a nuclear power and a country with a culture and size of Russia to be somehow subservient and just sort of, you know, uh, act like our pet or something. You know, that they're going to have their own positions and they're going to do things we don't like. But I don't think that fundamentally they've been in the post-communist period, and they are post-communist. The Communist Party of Russia today is like got what 4% of the vote. I mean, it's not very powerful. So the result is that we should try to end this war. It's good for Ukraine. It's good for Russia. It's good for the world. And the thing is, we need to find some settlement. And the problem I see right now is that the Ukrainians are totally unwilling and completely to make a peace deal. They're totally intransigent. I mean, just think about it. Now, the Russians have a position that their negotiating position is fairly severe and pretty extreme. But the question is, there's never been any real serious offers, in my opinion, from the Ukrainians, other than say, "Hey, Russia, go home, we win." And obviously, they're losing the war. You follow it day to day. Yeah, the Ukrainians can pull off some nifty little attacks from time to time, like that attack on those bombers, or the some the incursion into Kursk, which cost them a lot of troops and ended up getting them run out of Kursk. Now Russia's moving in the Sunni direction. I mean, all this stuff is futile. It's losing a lot of manpower. I mean, you have, Trump points out he'll use some figure, which I don't know if it's accurate or not. He's pretty bad with figures, but but let's say 6,000 people are dying. But the problem is what? 5,000 of them are Ukrainians and 1,000 are Russians per day or whatever he's talking about. And that's the kind of thing it is. The Ukrainians have a smaller population and they're losing. And the only reason they're even in the game at all is all the Western support. So we're propping them up to have more and more of their people killed. But ultimately, I don't think it leads to a victory. It could either lead to their defeat or to an escalation to a conflict I don't think we want to have. That with potentially some sort of a nuclear conflict. Not because Russia is eager to use a nuclear weapon or likely to, but if you press it hard enough that where you really are defeating Russia, I think that's where it does come into play. And so we need to put pressure on the Ukrainians, I think, in order to make a deal. That's my viewpoint. The theory, on the other hand, is that this trying to super sanction Russia by saying they can't sell any oil to anybody will bring them to their heels. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. I'm kind of the mindset, if that's such a good idea, then why didn't we do it 2 or 3 years ago? Why now? I mean, but the thing is that I have another thing that's brewing right now is the whole BRICS situation, which I don't know where that's leading to, but that's about a little over a week away. Well, not a week away from when you see this probably, but it's coming up, and I don't know how that's going to play. And this ongoing battle of tariffs and sanctions and all this is creating a situation where I think that something like BRICS would become fairly tempting, in fact, to a lot of countries that may be tired of somebody from Washington just one day saying, we don't like this or that thing about your policy, so we're going to try to put an economic calamity on your country. But that in itself, I think, is a bit of a problem, I think. And we'll see. But the problem is also, even if Trump agrees with what I'm saying here, he's under such pressure at home that I don't think he can make that sort of a deal very easily. And so the conflict continues. But in my opinion, is strategically this was a Western offensive against Russia. The the Russian reaction was basically in the form of a countermove at the operational level. And what they were originally intending, I believe, was probably twofold. One, that they had a fantasy scenario and a real scenario. The real scenario was well. Let's go with the fantasy scenario was that they would rush in there with a smaller army. The Ukrainian regime would collapse, and they would agree to a deal, put a more favorable government in place that would the Russians could accept. The Russians would pull out, and the whole thing would be solved. I think that was their realistic plan. I mean, the fantasy plan. The realistic plan is what came next when that failed, which was okay, let's get into a negotiation and settle our differences over the areas in eastern Ukraine, in Donbass and Luhansk. Okay. And what happened then is the West, in the form of the British and probably the U.S. too, although it was really the uh, Boris Johnson that really made the big move, convinced them not to make a deal, and then we agreed to provide all these billions and billions of dollars of weapons and support that's been going on ever since then. And the idea that somehow they would run the Russians out, but then the Russians have now so mobilized that that's no longer a viable idea, I think. So, in a nutshell, I would say that that I think that we should the Ukrainians need to be forced to accept some kind of a deal. My own opinion is it shouldn't be what the Russians have on the table, flat out. No, I don't. I think that there ought to be, but I think if the Ukrainians show some flexibility, I think then we can negotiate something. My own idea would be that probably you take the Russian deal that's proposed, but keep Russia on the east side of the river, the Dnieper River. Okay, so those areas on the west side, they don't get. They agree to pull out of these areas in the other oblasts in the north, like Sunni and so forth, back to their own territory. And then there would be some fundamental demilitarization of Ukraine and Russia. Because I don't think Russia wants to maintain an army as big as they have right now in perpetuity, for one thing. And the other thing is that Ukraine would then become a neutral country, not in NATO, with a somewhat smaller military, but probably not as small as what the Russians are demanding now. And I think that a deal can be worked out along those lines if the regime in Kiev could accept it. But again, the problem there is I think that if Zelensky tried to accept that, he would probably be purged. So I don't know where we go from here in practice, but that's my opinion on it. So anyway, I'll be wrapping this up for now, and as always, I'll be posting this on YouTube and Rumble, and the address of my social media accounts are in the description below. So that's all for this time.